Well, hello and good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for what is the very first presidential lecture of 2021. I know these are incredibly challenging times for you all, so it's even better that you have given up your time this evening to join us. And this has been a very popular lecture. We've had nearly 1,000 people who are signed up. I hope that we say we've got 309 actually watching live at the moment, and many watch it on delay. And the title of this presidential lecture is In Place of Fear. And it relates to a book that was published a year ago, Intelligent Kindness, Rehabilitating the Welfare State. And I guess the fundamental part behind this is connecting to our deeper values. And I'm absolutely thrilled that we've got the three authors here this evening who are going to talk to you about intelligent kindness, what it is and what it means to all of us and what we should do. You can post questions in the Q&A. It'd be really great if you could put many questions down. If you could try to confine them to the subject today. I know there are so many things people like to ask questions about, but so that we can get best value out of today's session and the topic, if you could post questions that are relevant to that. And we've got about 20 minutes at the end of the session in order to put those questions to our presenters. So I think they're going to come on screen now. We've got three presenters. They're going to present and hand over to each other one after the other. Our first presenter is Chris Maloney. Chris was a consultant medical psychotherapist and then a GP partner in Hackney in East London. He's also an independent psychiatric and medical practice with people seeking asylum, and is co-editing a book at the moment on seeking asylum and mental health for the College and Cambridge University Press. He's then going to hand over to Penny Campling. Penny worked for many years at the NHS as a consultant psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and clinical director. She has a particular interest in the power of groups to nurture and heal. She's an independent psychotherapist, writer, and blogger, and currently is supporting frontline intensive care staff during the pandemic. So great to hear about that, Penny. And our final speaker will be John Ballatt. John worked as a practitioner, trainer, manager and executive director in the voluntary sector, local government and in the NHS. He now writes, lectures and offers consultancy and support at all levels in the system. So over to you, Chris. We're absolutely delighted to have you all here and to hear what you've got to say. So thank you.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for inviting us to give the lecture today. We're actually going to talk about fear and the alternatives to fear, but I think you'll see as we go through how this relates to kindness. I'm going to start by saying a little about the pros and cons of living in groups, and then consider our animal cousins, the monkeys and apes, and the way they use and manage fear in order to organize themselves. This can tell us something about our own choices in the matter. Penny will then be thinking about fear in the pandemic and how it's testing both our intellectual and our animal selves. And John will finish by reflecting on how our organizations can process or not process the things that make us afraid. As far as I can tell, many people's reserves, both across the country and maybe across the world, feel like they're running out just now. These may be physical reserves like a regular income, a business, or one's savings, or internal ones like patience, forbearance and endurance, or even just good humour and good manners. It's a highly anxious time. Anxiety or fear isn't all that we're feeling, but it's a pretty powerful driving force, and it conditions many of the other feelings that we have. Of course, illness, injury, predators and death are the very stuff of life, and it's often the fear of them that spurs us into action and makes us keep ourselves safe. The secret is having enough fear to be vigilant, avoid trouble and take action when it's needed, but not to be inhibited or overwhelmed by it. And one very good way to keep safe can be by living in a group. Humans are born into groups and we grow up and develop in them. In modern life, we move freely between many different types of group, or we did until recently, and maybe that's part of our current problem. Our sense of identity comes in large part from how we're able to function in each and every one of the groups that we're part of. Groups offer safety in numbers, a chance to pool resources in times of trouble, and a chance for joint creativity and problem solving. There are risks though. There are still predators and prey, there can be fierce competition, and of course disease can spread rapidly, as can fear itself. The different forms of group living are the meat and drink of ethology, the study of animal behaviour. This discipline developed in the second half of the 20th century with more than half an eye on what we might learn about ourselves by studying other creatures. I'm now going to introduce the work of an ethologist called Michael Chance. I'm hoping you'll find that it offers an impressive kind of metaphor for better understanding ourselves. Now I'm just going to set up a screen share so that I can show you some family photographs. Chance did his early thinking in the 1940s and 1950s, and although ethology may have become more detailed and sophisticated since then, his work was quite pioneering. I'm going to explain one of his big ideas to you. That's about agonic and hedonic modes of group functioning. Chance had trained as a pharmacologist. He worked for Glaxo, and then he went to the War Office in 1942. He'd been asked to look at how to measure the potency of stimulant drugs like amphetamines. This was worked on lab animals, and he noticed that the effects of the drugs actually varied greatly according to whether they were given to isolated individuals or to those living in close proximity with others. This led him into studying the effects of group living on the supposedly inherent or biological natures of the group members. He became interested in the evolution of group behaviours, and particularly how different ways of handling the allocation of resources and issues of dominance affect the individual and group states of mind. If you put any group of creatures together at close quarters, the big risk is that they'll fight amongst themselves to establish their relative positions and who has what. This can do a lot of damage and use up scarce resources, and it actually cancels out many of the advantages of living together. So there need to be ways of transacting these issues of power and possession that can reliably avoid this open conflict. The evolutionary solution was both a psychological and a behavioural one. Groups arise where the members broadly accept that there's a social hierarchy structured according to mutually recognised markers of status. These often include stylized aggressive gestures. Within this framework, most encounters involve warding off threats to your own status and being very wary of the status of others. Chance and his colleagues termed this the agonic mode of group functioning. Your position in the group is negotiated through the management of fear rather than physical conflict, and fear has become a route to social organisation. As a result, tension and arousal are high. This chronic high tension, but without a breakdown into open conflict, is characteristic of the agonic mode. Many primate groups function in this way, and they're relatively fixed in it. These include macaques, which are the most widespread old world monkeys, some of whom we've just been looking at. Also includes baboons. These are forms of baboon dominance display, and they're pretty intimidating. Although it's highly effective in preventing open warfare, the chronic stress and tension of the agonic mode is uncomfortable and potentially distracting, and it misses out on the chance for joint problem solving and creativity. So evolution moved on, and another form of group living emerged, which Chance termed the hedonic mode. This is much more typical of the so-called higher primates, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. Both spend a lot of their time nurturing their social relationships. There's a lot of competitive play, and this is followed by displays of tenderness with gentle touching, grooming, and kissing. Difficult to communicate through a Zoom call. The hedonic mode has many rituals of affiliation, reconciliation, and reassurance. And chimps also stage flamboyant displays in order to attract followers. They undoubtedly compete for attention and status, but it's a different form of competition from the posturing and intimidation of the agonic mode. The preoccupations have become linking and inclusion, finding points of contact or similarity, and recruiting allies. Apart from short-lived bursts of excitement, the levels of tension and arousal are characteristically low in these groups, and this frees up attention for furthering the group's progress. It's also an important way of enabling succession, the transition between one generation, or indeed one administration, and the next. This can be smoothly negotiated rather than requiring insurrection and collateral damage. The members of hedonic groups are not all of equal status, and there can still be conflict, but the low arousal leaves individuals much more able to form a network of mutually supportive relationships. This freeing up of attention from self-protection allows the expression of intelligence and creativity, and a virtual circle of reciprocity. I hope you think this makes a lot of sense, but there is a caveat. Although the hedonic mode promotes self-confidence and empathic cooperation, it's very vulnerable under pressure. Observations of chimps since Chance first published have shown that when times become hard and resources run out, hedonic groups can readily collapse into open conflict, and the individuals do fight it out amongst themselves. This has happened to chimps, particularly in recent years, as their habitats have come under threat from humans. In fact, there's an argument that agonic groups actually do much better under severe pressure, since they're always preoccupied with avoiding direct conflict, even at the best of times. Now, I'm hoping that all this will be helping you reflect on your own personal and professional lives, as well as the bigger picture. Chance's work indicates that kind and considerate attention to the needs and feelings of others isn't simply a lifestyle choice for the sentimentally inclined. It's powerful social glue that helps groups hold together, avoid inherent conflict, and free up intelligence, attention, and creativity for dealing with the problems of life. It's also worth emphasizing that all this isn't simply about ways of behaving, it's about states of mind. Chance takes the clear view that the way we organize our group relations actually structures our internal experience and our cognitive function, as well as vice versa. Human life shows many examples of both agonic and hedonic functioning, and of shifts between the two. There are many advantages to living hedonically, but we do have to be mindful of that caveat. The hedonic mode can readily break down into open warfare if it's not attended to under pressure. If the soothing and affiliative rituals have fallen by the wayside, it may well help if the agonic defenses, the daily currency of high arousal groups, can be called into play until hedonic order can be re-established. Since we're relatively good at observing and understanding our own behavior, humans may be well placed to make the choice to live hedonically, but mobilize agonic defenses when needed, especially when we're consciously aware of the pros and cons of each. Now, groups have lives of their own, but they are made up of their members, and individual character does matter. Sometimes single individuals can powerfully affect the whole. Does every individual want to do the work of the hedonic mode? Do they value creativity, innovation, and relaxed intimacy with others? Or can it be more attractive and exciting to be agonic? If you do want your group to go down the hedonic route, then there may be a lot of that hedonic work of soothing and affiliation that needs to be done, especially when times are hard and our physical relatedness as creatures has been profoundly disrupted. Times are hard just now, and Penny's going to talk about how some individuals and groups have been making choices in the face of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I'm still seeing your screen share. Okay. So let's hang on to, can you see me? Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's hang on to that idea that we have some choice about how we manage fear as a society, in our organizations, and in our day-to-day relationships. But what a difficult one. As psychiatrists, we know that fear can feel the most uncontrollable of emotions, taking us over body and mind. Since the pandemic started, I've thought a lot about fear, including my own experience of fear that visits only occasionally, thank goodness, often in the middle of the night, sometimes with nightmares, reminding me that I'm more frightened about what's going on than I realized. And there seems to be at least anecdotal evidence that such nightmares are increasingly common. But what I want to focus on today is the work I've been doing with staff from our local intensive care unit, who, as you can imagine, are having to process fear on a major scale. First, there's the fear of dying. Since I retired from the NHS, I have a small independent psychotherapy practice. And even before I'd volunteered my services to ICU, 2 clinicians referred themselves both scared out of their wits by what they were observing in China and Italy. Both were very clear-sighted and could see with prophetic insight how things were going to play out and affect their services. They were scared by what they saw looming on the horizon, and it wasn't even designated a pandemic then. And also scared by, I suppose you could say, a lack of fear in those who would have a major part to play in protecting us, the government and top managers in their organization. Both were consumed by a profound dread that they themselves would die. Both of them were women and had particular responsibilities, one for a young disabled son, the other for a particularly vulnerable sibling. They knew how their deaths would impact on their loved ones, and it was this thought that was unbearable, magnifying the dread and the acute awareness of their own mortality. Both of them knew that the risk was relatively small and that their fear was out of perspective, and it would have seemed patronizing to focus on this. Instead, we faced the idea of them dying full on, talked about their vulnerable family members, and even how one might adjust her will. Those 2 sessions in 1 week at the beginning of March will stay with me. The terror, the fear of imminent death in the room was tangible, communicating body to body. Generally, though, I found people talk less about the fear of their own death, although they seem very relieved when I ask about this, whilst the fear of infecting other people, particularly close family, is very much at the front of their minds. It was heartbreaking, particularly at the start when PPE was so hard to get hold of, to hear the lengths people were going through to scrub themselves clean. And still, most of the staff I speak to have elaborate rituals when they get home. No contact until they've stripped off, put the washing machine on and showered, disinfected their car, their keys, their mobile phone. Many sleep apart from their partners. As well as the fear of literally infecting their loved ones with the virus, there is a fear of contaminating them with the horrors they are witnessing. And sometimes it feels as if they mix up the two. Some of them understandably make a conscious decision to try to keep their homes as some sort of haven where they don't talk about work. Fair enough. But I've been amazed at how protective they tend to be towards their partners. And sometimes this protectiveness just leaves everyone in the family on their own with their fears. It's often a child's misbehavior that motivates them to seek help, behavior that will often change dramatically if the child is encouraged to talk about how frightened they are feeling, worries that their mum might catch COVID from work and die. So much better to get that fear out in the open. A lot of people first come to see me after experiencing panic attacks, sometimes very obviously and directly connected to distressing circumstances at work, but quite often taking them by surprise in the car park or the supermarket. The nature of this illness seems to be particularly distressing. Many remark on the fear in the patient's eyes on admission to ICU. Patients who were leading a normal life a few weeks earlier, some of them healthcare workers themselves, some of them the same age as the staff looking after them, very many of them the same age as the staff members' parents. The nurses particularly, often looking after the same very ill patients for a 12-hour shift, describe the particular quality of gasping respiratory distress as unbearable. And having recently sat with my dad as he died of heart failure, I have some sense of this. I found I had to concentrate sometimes to keep my own breathing steady. It made me wonder if the nurses' panic attacks are somehow linked to the gasping breaths of their patients. The work has really brought home to me the importance of working with the body, being aware of posture and breathing, for example, the way we can unconsciously mirror the bodily distress of someone in close proximity, the way such distress can be communicated muscle to muscle, lungs to lungs. Wearing full PPE is, of course, a nightmare in itself. It's horribly hot, uncomfortable, restricts movement, restricts vision and hearing, makes it difficult to get heard and leaves people isolated and depersonalized. For some, it has become the main focus of fear. I was actually asked to see one woman because she'd gone frantic in a COVID-dense area, ripping off her PPE. There's a huge anxiety about losing control, particularly amongst the nurses. Whilst the doctors tend to move around from patient to patient, trying to problem solve, the nurses feel very stuck in one place, trying to manage their sense of being overwhelmed, but also the sense of being isolated and trapped, unable to leave the patients. And as ICU has expanded into other areas, the sense of being trapped and forgotten about has got worse. Many of them fear not being able to get to the toilet and reduce their drinking accordingly, incontinence being the ultimate humiliation and actually not so uncommon. Breaking down in tears is also a fear. I try to reframe this more positively, but crying in high-grade masks is a very uncomfortable experience. Everyone, of course, is affected by the sheer number of deaths, not just the number, but the manner of death and the unpredictability, with patients who seem to be getting better suddenly deteriorating for no obvious reason. There's been a lot of talk about moral injury in relation to clinicians on the front line in this pandemic, but a lot of ICU staff still aren't aware of the concept. And some of them are lost in the miserable shame of embodying it, feeling somehow the situation they're in is their fault. Some of them asking me directly if I think they're a bad person. So, fear of death, fear of dying oneself or infecting others, fear of losing control, fear of being a moral failure, and of course, fear of doing something wrong, of making a mistake. That's a lot of fear. Does Michael Chance and his study of groups of primates have anything helpful to contribute? Well, I think the answer is yes. Chance talks about the hedonic mode of organisation, where anxiety levels are generally low and relationships are mutually nurturing and playful. The chimpanzees, for example, spend lots of their time grooming each other, a comforting ritual that in itself reduces anxiety levels. The result is a reinforcing, virtuous circle that frees up creative intelligence and the capacity for problem solving. This might remind some of you of the virtuous circle of intelligent kindness, which we explore in our book. In the opposite, an agonic culture, relationships are strictly hierarchical, and much attention and energy goes into anxiously making sure you're not being punished by those above you and that those below you don't get one over you. This hypervigilance takes up time and energy. A culture of fear is created where everyone goes around anxiously watching their backs. So Chris and Michael Chance, of course, remind us not to get too sentimental about hedonic cultures. Agonic cultures are at least used to keeping order and managing high levels of tension and fear without destroying each other. Whereas hedonic cultures are easily taken by surprise, rising levels of fear leading quickly into crazed murderousness. Something like this happened with chimpanzees in the Gombe Stream Reserve, famously observed by Jane Goodall and her team. Now, ICUs generally get a good press, and certainly in Leicester, it seems they are stepping up extraordinarily well in the present crisis, learning and adapting super fast to the unpredictable nature of a new disease, problem solving on the hoof. And I'm suggesting that perhaps they have a good balance of hedonic and agonic practice. They are, of course, used to managing high levels of anxiety and tension, being, I guess, the most acute of acute services. They are used to a high number of their patients dying, although, of course, nothing compares to what they are having to manage at the moment. Presumably, they are adept at flicking easily into a command and control mode of organisation in a crisis, and all importantly, flipping back again. But they also really seem to value the qualities Michael Chance identified as hedonic, investing time in building and nurturing relationships, recognising that the patient's prognoses will be significantly improved if families are engaged in the enterprise, valuing regular, mutually nurturing, team-building rituals such as buddy schemes, prioritising coffee breaks together, and tea and toast at the end of a night shift. The consultants tell me how closely they work as a team, doing handover ward rounds together so they can share their intelligence, making sure they are never left on their own with a difficult decision. A simple example of consciously reducing the escalation of fear that psychiatrists might well borrow. Of course, all this is challenged and compromised at the present time with the need to distance and limit the footfall in COVID areas. In the first wave, many of the rituals were swept aside as they coped with more patients, a huge influx of staff from other specialties, and the need to spread out more thinly as they took over theatre space. But they learnt very quickly the cost of stopping such mutually nurturing practices, and now, despite the huge pressure they're under, do everything they can to consciously put relationships within the team high on the agenda. I've just helped two clinicians overwhelmed by anxiety symptoms back to work after a period off sick. Both fed back on the warm welcome, the kindness of their colleagues, and that despite the very obvious exhaustion around, there was still a degree of friendly, chirpy banter. So a sense of camaraderie, and investment in these mutually nurturing, fear-soothing behaviours that I actually find quite remarkable given the level of trauma and exhaustion. I would like to suggest we could all learn from it. And I'm going to hand over now to John.
So I'll start again. Those experiences of ICU staff during the pandemic are extreme cases in extreme times. But it'd be wrong to suggest that they're of a completely different nature to those of all staff working in healthcare at any time. Recently, a senior, highly experienced psychiatrist I know told me how she struggles not to throw up in the morning before going to work. I won't tell you where that is for reasons that will become obvious. Basically, she isn't overly troubled by her clinical work in itself. It's the climate of the organization she works in that fills her with dread, a dread that began well before COVID. She experiences it as being in constant, often ruthless denial of her and her colleagues' lived experience. She finds little acknowledgement of the inevitable costs to staff and patient well-being of organizing limited resources, physical and human, to meet increasing need. The risks that she and her colleagues and patients have to face when services are spread so thinly are never owned in the hierarchy. The anxiety and risk are more often just left with the practitioners struggling with dangerously high caseloads, along with mechanical assertions of good intentions, so-called evidence, and expectations, and scrutiny. Demands are made with no readiness to listen to what they mean to staff. Relationships within teams, between professions, and between parts of the service are suffering. Conflict is rising. The need for staff individually and together to build and sustain the relationships within which to process any of this, let alone the everyday anxieties of working with severe mental suffering, is not acknowledged. My colleague just does not feel safe at work. Turning a blind eye to the fact that anxiety is always lurking in the task of meeting and working with ill-being and illness is dangerous enough. Willful evasion of the effects of the ways in which leaders communicate, intervene, make demands, manage performance, and acknowledge problems makes for a toxic culture. As Chris said, some anxiety, enough to direct our attention, to take things seriously, to act appropriately, is of course helpful. Indeed, if you're not a bit anxious, you're probably verging on acting mechanically, without enough attentiveness, thought, or sufficient attention to risk. But anxiety and its more dramatic relative fear can be highly toxic too. It can preoccupy, distract, blur the awareness, lead to errors and breakdowns in communication. It can lead to despair, to conflict, to closing down to self, the patient, the colleague, to watching your back like those agonic baboons. When it is excessive and chronic, it can lead to the burnout of individuals and to malfunctioning services. Of course, the organization I've described may be an outlier, but there is always the danger that such a culture can grow. It is perhaps an example of a particularly grim agonic culture. It's partly the result of the dangers inherent in embracing an industrial, technical, even command and control way of looking at things without giving equal attention to the crucial psychological and relational aspect of any kind of healthcare work or system. Both views are important. In fact, they depend on each other. But to do justice to the relational view, everybody, especially leadership, has to value both. And vitally, we have to manage to acknowledge and contain our anxiety and fear enough to open our eyes and ears to each other, up and down the hierarchy and horizontally. Failure to do so means all too often turning a blind eye to crucial aspects of the lived experience of staff, of colleagues, and patients. In such circumstances, it's no surprise that no structures, time, or permission are offered to staff to build and sustain the relationships that will in turn sustain them and the quality of their practice, individual and collective. Whatever the limits to resources, Whatever the constraints, open dialogue, acknowledgement of problems, mutual learning and collective commitment to working together are always going to be better than an anxious, alienated, resentful, even conflictual organization. The challenge for the individual, the team, and the wider system is always to be able to notice and contain anxiety and fear so that proper attention can be given to problem solving, creativity, and cooperation. To do that, and to bring the best of ourselves to our work, we need an environment that values and builds curiosity, openness and honesty, mutual attentiveness and care, and solidarity in working together. This is, of course, a relative of that primate hedonic mode Chris spoke of, with all its benefits, but also with its vulnerabilities. All of us, clinicians, managers, and administrators, need to commit to building such a culture and to managing together the factors that can damage it. It is this kind of community that will best sustain the quality and effectiveness of clinical practice and the well-being of clinicians and the experience of the patient. Now, let's widen our view. There are many anxious voices warning of greatly increased mental health problems in our society after the pandemic. They point to the likely effects of living with the fear and awful consequences of COVID, and of the disruptions to social life of the measures taken to respond to it. The anxiety, anger, and mistrust that have grown in response to how these things are being managed will also contribute to this escalation of mental ill-being. There are signs of dangerous social fragmentation and conflict. Then there is the likely increase in unemployment and poverty. Children, single parents, lonely older people, members of Black and minority ethnic groups, people with long COVID, and indeed traumatized healthcare workers are all groups identified as likely to be in need. Personally, I think this increase in mental distress is highly likely. Indeed, it's already here. What alarms me is that the discourse seems mainly to forget that most of these issues have been escalating for a very long time. We've been in a period of chronic crisis for years. The social determinants of mental vulnerability and disorder have been increasing, particularly since the 2008 crash. Poverty, inequality, inhumane benefit systems, racial injustice, and reduction in public services are all contributing factors. Mental health services, especially but by no means all, only CAMS and older peoples, have been badly, perhaps even scandalously, under-resourced. How do we respond as a society? Will we do what's happening in our colleagues' trust? Just tell inadequate services what the need is and to get on with meeting it, however impossible that is? Will we make moonshot gestures, setting up call centers staffed by people on the minimum wage to meet this need? Will we outsource services to organizations with no expertise, driven by profit? Will we create labyrinthine eligibility and access systems to slow down demand? Will we continue to sideline mental health as a society, just as trusts can neglect the relational aspect of their services? Okay, I hope you get my drift. There is an alternative, but it will mean a change. Our title was borrowed from Bevan's 1952 book, as Adrian said, In Place of Fear. In it, Bevan lays out the reasons for a centrally and locally organized national health service that's accessible to, responsible to, responsive to, owned and funded by, and then free to everyone. Such a system allays fears about illness, about lack of access to care, and deploys human intelligence, skills, and resources to help individuals and society as a whole. We're arguing that in the light of what we nowadays know about the threats and determinants of our personal and collective well-being, an even more ambitious and inclusive project is required. We face an acute phase of a long incubating condition, frighteningly rising mental ill-being. We also face the option of denying or minimizing it. Or we could work together to acknowledge it and do something that will help. And that we would have to involve the NHS, but also most parts of central and local government, education, the voluntary sector, citizens, and professional organizations like the college. We need to develop an inclusive, realistic national strategy now. Though such a project would be complex and expensive, the cost of not doing it will be far worse, as you know all too well. Whether in NHS trusts, communities, or in the nation as a whole, we need at all levels to face our fears together with as much honesty and realism as we can. We need to engage with and support each other to acknowledge these feelings and these realities, and to plan and act intelligently, humanely, and proportionately to address them together. Thank you very much from the three of us for listening.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Chris, Penny, and John, for your amazing presentations, thoughtful, timely, and I think really making us think about not only the pandemic, but the situation we've all been working in and living in for so many years. Great comments in the chat, lots of favourable comments, and big thank yous to all of you. We've got an audience at the moment of 555 people watching live, which is amazing. An international audience. A big welcome to Syed Inam, Professor of Psychiatry in Bangladesh, who is joining us. You're very welcome, Syed. Great that you could join us. And we've also in the chat, if you actually want to buy the book, there's a link to how you can actually buy the book and also a discount code. So that's worth having. So I'm going to move on to some questions and say we've got some great questions in the chat. The first question I wanted to ask, really it's really directed at you, Chris, from Tunde, says that are there any examples of studies showing timely preventative transition between agonic and hedonic groups to maintain homeostasis and prevent mass destructions in human history? Any examples of those?
They're hard to think of. I suppose the difficulty is that it's the mass destructions that you notice, and the times that mass destruction is avoided doesn't attract quite so much attention. But I guess this would be about situations where, I mean, it's almost about not being, although you prize hedonic values, not being afraid to be authoritarian at times. And that's maybe what comes over from that work, that you can both value inclusivity, kindness, soothing, affiliation, but there does come a time when you've got to do the agonic gesture, calm things down, stop things happening. And doing that in a timely way is better than waiting until all havoc breaks loose. And there's a bit of sort of basic parenting skills in that as well. You stop a child from doing something whilst you're still in control of yourself. You don't wait until you've completely lost your temper before you finally put a limit on something. So it's maybe as ordinary as that in a way.
I think there is some learning from the forces. I have a colleague who's worked for many years supporting forces out in war zones, and she's been constantly struck by how they return always to the hedonic when they're not in battle, when they're preparing, when they're coming back from trauma. And they really force themselves to pay attention to restoring that hedonic mode. But that has the paradox that it enables them to be more effective when they move into the agonic. They trust the leader. They trust that there's a reason to act immediately. They trust that there's a need to deploy themselves as rapidly and as focused with as much focus as possible. So I think there's a lot of evidence in working with the forces.
Thanks for that. Another question, this time for you, Penny. What should CAM services be offering in relation to the significant increase in referrals of children and adolescents during the pandemic? Any particular tips for CAMS services?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think what we're being told is the scale of mental ill health in children is growing very rapidly and far beyond anything that our existing structures could cope with. I think we've got to think very radically, and I think we've got to think across other organisations. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about, and when I first wrote this talk, I mean, one thing Chris and John and I all share is that we've all worked in therapeutic communities as part of our career, particularly me, because it was most of my career in my case. And of course, therapeutic communities are now seen as very expensive, and a lot of them closed down because of that. But actually, they started at the end of the Second World War, when thousands of soldiers were coming back very psychologically bruised and damaged. Weren't enough psychiatrists to treat them, so people started getting them to groups and building communities which relied on the resources. And I think if you work in therapeutic communities, one thing you become very confident about is the strength and emotional intelligence in ordinary people, including people with mental health problems. So I think we've got to find some way of capitalizing on that. And I think it can't just be trying to desperately train up more mental health staff. We've got to think about how we build on mental health expertise in the communities.
Okay, thanks for that. I wanted a general question about innate fears. And one of the questioners says, will the pandemic lead to the re-emergence of innate fears of germs for years or even generations to come?
I suppose fear of germs is pretty well rooted, certainly throughout my psychiatric career. It's been a frequent symptom has been fear of contamination, and that is well rooted in all sorts of people who don't even have mental health problems. The interesting thing is that germs as such were only discovered relatively recently. We haven't had, even doctors were hard pushed to get them to wash their hands even only 150 years ago. So it might be relatively recent, that understanding. But there's a fear of contamination. I was quite mindful when the lockdown first started of my own sort of sense of a deep-rooted fear of contamination, and was wondering if this was actually something archetypal, to use the sort of Jungian framework, the sort of just some archetype of plague and contamination. And I tried to find it. I couldn't find one. There's nothing in his collective works about anything about pestilence or plague that I could turn up. And I was really rather surprised by that. So yeah, maybe it is a modern thing, and maybe it will become more deep-rooted. Maybe we'll all be giving each other a wide berth when we walk down the street for many years to come, and we might forget why it is. You might go into a pub, and if you're not a local, they might all stare at you and wonder who you are. Those days aren't long gone, and maybe they'll be coming back.
It's a really interesting question about it. It's getting slightly off the question, but whether we're going to have to relearn how to be in groups together in some ways, particularly children. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch this generation of children that have been hit tender milestones during this pandemic and what effect that's had on them.
And I also think that the sense in which fear will become unconscious after the actual specific risks of the pandemic may affect not conscious feelings of fear about being infected, etc. But I think they may well affect people's trust in each other, people's sense of how safe it is to be with each other, and that will need, especially with vulnerable groups like children, but others, it will need attention, and we'll need to look at some of the social consequences on the streets.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've been asked to remind members of the college that you're eligible for a 30% discount via the code in the members area of the RC Psych website. So now I want to move on to a question about blame culture and scapegoating. And Desmond Dunleavy asks, does the concept of blame culture or scapegoating relate in any manner to the animal models that you've used?
The word scapegoat, of course, comes right back to sending a goat out to carry all the sins of the group in the Bible. And I think we have pretty good evidence that that has happened in tribes, in communities, in societies where we bang people away, etc., etc., and sometimes don't realize that by banging people away, they will come back furious and upset and damaged. So I think there is a very clear sort of ethological, anthropological root to that. But I think the blame culture that we live in now has particular issues to do with authority, and indeed the way in which people in authority, whether they be politicians or bosses, try to fend off the problems of the system and why things have gone wrong, and instead replace it with blame and punishment. I think that's also pretty obvious in stories in which very vulnerable staff are getting punished for being ill in lots of ways in our system as we speak now. The way in which the blame culture can be mitigated, I think, is by that sense of honesty I was talking about, where the problems can be acknowledged, the weaknesses can be acknowledged, but the recognition that what's going on is much of the time, not all of the time, much of the time the product of the collective, the way in which the system is working, and therefore the system needs to attend, rather than seeking out and punishing the miscreant.
Either of the two of you want to come in on that one as well?
I'm just looking at the chat actually, and Penny Crick has said fear of contagion is described well in Defoe's The Plague Year, and how people group together and set up tight boundaries around their communities from strangers and those who looked sick. So I guess, you know, the blame culture and contagion is quite closely linked, isn't it?
Well, I'm going to move on to another question from Diane Gosler, and she asks about the importance of groups, and she asks, how can we cope with social distancing for such a long time when we know that groups are so important? And I guess related to that, do you have any advice about, as we move from essentially a lot of our interactions are online back to that human contact, in how groups should function in an effective and positive way? What's likely to happen?
Well, we've lost the animal contact with people. We've lost the just rubbing up against people, quite literally. We've lost the whole impression about how people smell and how they move, and the fact that if you walk around in a group of people, you've got to make sure not to bang into them and this sort of thing. Or if you do, and then you have all your sort of conciliatory gestures, and there's that whole aspect of physical being that helps us structure our senses of identity, as I think I was talking about earlier. And whilst we're separate, I think we've really got to think about that, and the fact that Zoom is very good at transmitting ideas, it's very good at practical arrangements, it can be good for problem solving, but it isn't very good for the literally the nitpicking sort of social interaction and hugging and kissing and all that sort of stuff. Of course, one wonders how long it is before the social kiss is going to return, never mind going within 1.5 meters of anyone. In the meantime, maybe we've got to attend to some sort of consciously adopted set of rituals that we have in our Zoom interactions and our telephone interactions and our other remote relatedness, and bring in those things that you could always presume that they would just happen when both of you were trying to get through the door at the same time or something. And there's all this sort of stepping back and after you, and those are really valuable hedonic interactions. They may seem trivial, but they're not. And the other thing with Zoom is the only thing we ever have on Zoom are mostly important conversations with people who really matter to us. And it's the trivial conversations with the people who we've just bumped into and never seen before and won't see again that help provide the glue for us as a society, but also the glue for our own internal senses of ourself, I think I would suggest.
I'm just thinking about the work on intensive care unit, which of course is a group when they're working as a team, and just having to work so much harder to get that sense of a team than you would in normal times. And if if this hadn't been an infectious disease, I would of course be on there running groups. As it is, I'm seeing most people on Zoom or sometimes in the garden or going for walks with them actually. But I've been aware that actually I'm sort of holding a kind of group function. I mean, I do pick up wisdom from individual members of staff and pass it. I mean, I don't obviously break confidentiality, but I pass it on to others, almost like I'm sort of the sort of interactions that might happen in a therapeutic group. I'm almost sort of I'm doing that, and I'm sure they're doing that a lot themselves. So I think it's just realizing that we have to work incredibly hard at it. I do remember when I started psychiatry, and I was started as a consultant on a therapeutic community, and recognizing how group living was very cultural. And this was sort of late 80s, so Thatcher years, and we were getting first of all a group of young adults who we were mostly working with, and that wouldn't eat together because they just had no experience of eating around a family table. And then 10 years on, we had, a younger generation that actually wouldn't sit and watch television together. They felt really uncomfortable. It made them really self-conscious. They'd got no experience of doing that. So I think these things are cultural, and we have to just very consciously kind of rebuild.
If I could add a slightly positive note as well here, Adrian. I've rather embarrassingly been running around the park recently, and there are rituals developing. People are spending more time making sure that they make eye contact and smile, that they greet each other, that when they do move to give each other space, they thank each other. There is an attempt to build that kind of sense of connectedness and maintain it, and that sense of being part of a group, of being part of a community. I actually embarrassingly know more of my neighbours in that park than I did before the pandemic. I would also just want to reinforce Penny's earlier comment about groups. When a group comes together, a therapeutic group, you always have to work to build what group analysts call the matrix. You have to build the habits through which communication of distress and vulnerability can happen. And so that may be more difficult after the pandemic as people come back anxious and unused to it. But I think there's a lot of hope there. And I really stress that both for practitioners to work in teams and to recognize the dynamics of the groups they're in, and to think about that with patients, is an absolutely crucial issue today.
Well, thanks for that. And just one final question, and it's going to go to each of you in turn. So next week, you've got 1 minute with the Secretary of State for Health. So you've got an opportunity to make a few key points and to suggest things, maybe 3 things they can actively do, particularly, I guess, in relation to rebuilding the NHS after the pandemic. It might be in relation to workforce. What are the helpful things that they could do? So what are you going to say to the Secretary of State? Chris, can we start with you?
Listen to what people are saying. Try and not be defensive. Try and be soothing. Don't strike any postures. And trust that if you do that, you might get some of it back.
Okay, great. Thanks, John.
Well, I would echo everything Chris has said. Thanks for taking the words out of my mouth, Chris. But I would also say, recognize that you're there to help, not to lead, to convene, not to organize. I don't mean not at all, but focus on those things. And hold on. Don't panic and turn away. Face it, because the people who are telling you the things, if you face it with them, will start to cooperate.
And Penny, finally to you, you get the last word.
I guess it's saying it in a slightly different way. I think we've got to start by facing our fears.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much, John, Chris and Penny. We've got fantastic comments, and thanks to you in the chat. Thank you for all you've done, your thoughtfulness over this, your guidance, and for giving up your time today. Don't forget to buy the book if you haven't bought it already, and it's a really good read. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, all of those who've asked questions, really very thoughtful, incisive questions, and also a big shout out to our college team, in particular Emma, Emily, Thomas and Peter. We couldn't put on these events without the huge support that we have. So thank you to all of you. I hope that you all have a pleasant evening and a weekend when that's actually with us. So thank you all so much and good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.